Today on The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of St. Joseph. I'm your host, Jim Havens, and our guest today is George Weigel, a distinguished senior fellow of Washington's Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's the best-selling author of more than 24 books, including the 2 volumes of his internationally acclaimed biography of St. John Paul II, Witness to Hope, and The End and the Beginning, and his newest book, Pomp, Circumstance, and Unsolicited Advice, Commencement Addresses and University Lectures. You can get it wherever you find books, also at the publisher Ignatius Press, ignatius.com. George Weigel, welcome to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
I'm fine, Jim. Roasting a bit like everyone on the East Coast these days, but we'll get through.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. Before we begin, I do want to remind everybody about iCatholic Mobile. It is the only Catholic mobile phone company in the U.S. today. So when you subscribe to iCatholic Mobile, you do help fund the Station of the Cross. You can check out iCatholic Mobile by going to iCatholicMobile.com. All right. I read this book in its entirety, very much enjoyed it. And in this book, George, you orient us to various big civilizational problems that we face. And this has been going on for some time. Many of these commencement addresses from 10, 20 years ago or more, and lectures in here. But many of the big problems certainly remain and perhaps have only maybe gotten deeper in many respects. But you also point the way to the solution, which also the solutions seem, in my view, to remain the same as well. So many of these themes carry throughout your commencement addresses and university lectures in the book. We're going to get into as much as we can today, but I want to start with what Father de Lubac called atheistic humanism, and said that all the evils of the 20th century were the products of this atheistic humanism in one way or another. You write about this here. You say, for the ancient world had experienced biblical religion as liberation, a liberation from the whimsies of fate. If God had created the world and the men and women who inhabited it, and if each human being had a direct link to the Creator through worship and prayer, then men and women were no longer the playthings of countless gods, spirits, and demons who played games with our lives. The biblical God was neither a willful tyrant nor a remote abstraction. He was not a cosmic watchmaker content to create the world and then leave it to its own devices. The God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus had entered history and had become our companion on the pilgrimage of life. To be in communion with this God was to be liberated from fate, liberated for freedom, liberated for human excellence. But what Judaism and Christianity proposed as liberation, atheistic humanism called bondage. Getting rid of God, it was argued, was the precondition to human despair. This was atheistic humanism on the march in the name of human liberation. And this new thing de Lubac proposed was at the heart of the crisis of the modern world. Moreover, this new idea had demonstrated that it had the gravest consequences. George, can you explain to us more about this? Make sure that we see this very clearly, particularly in its consequences.
Father Henri de Lubac was French Jesuit. He was part of the French resistance to the Nazi occupation of France during the Second World War. He edited at that time an underground resistance journal. And he turned his very fertile mind to the question, how did all this mess happen? The mess being Italian fascism, German National Socialism, Marxism, Leninism in Russia, this whole new phenomenon of the totalitarian state. And he came to the view that European high culture from the, I would say, mid-19th century on, had been dominated by the determination to throw the God of the Bible over the side of the ship as the human story proceeded through history, because the God of the Bible was an oppressor, kept men and women immature, unliberated. And as de Lubac points out, and you just read, this is a complete inversion of the historical truth of the matter. Think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, 2 of the foundational works of Western civilization. In those works, even the strongest of men, Achilles in the Iliad, Odysseus in the Odyssey, are merely gaming pieces on a cosmic gaming board being manipulated by the gods of Olympus who are, having fun manipulating human lives. We go to the Old Testament. The Phoenician Philistine god Moloch, who demands and gets child sacrifice. These were the gods of the ancient world. They were not nice people. They were not nice gods, I should say. Of course, the same thing was true here in the Western Hemisphere with the Aztec practice of human sacrifice, etc. Into that kind of a world, the God of the Bible, who speaks to Elijah in that still small sound, while Elijah is hovering behind a rock, the God who journeys with Israel through the desert, the God who we believe as Christians demonstrates the power of self-sacrificing love in the passion, death, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus. This is a very different kind of God. He doesn't play games. This God does not play games with human lives. He comes into human history to free us from the terrors of evil spirits, from the terrible things that nature can do. So to say that this God of the Bible was an oppressor was just to get everything turned upside down and inside out. Now, the further point that Father de Lubac made was that human beings are, and here I'll use a 25-cent word, theotropic. They're going to worship something. We are hardwired to worship something. And if we're not worshiping the true God, we're going to worship false gods. And that was the God of race in the Nazi case, the God of the revolution in the Leninist case, the communist case. And those false gods and that false worship had made an abattoir, a slaughterhouse, out of the first 5 decades of the 20th century. So that was de Lubac's point in the book he wrote in 1942, right in the middle of the Second World War, called The Drama of Atheistic Humanism. And de Lubac, of course, went on to have a significant influence at the Second Vatican Council and became a great friend of a young Polish bishop there, Karol Wojtyła, who would, as Pope John Paul II, make Father de Lubac a cardinal.
Yeah, very important that we see this. George Weigel is with us. Very grateful for him to be here with us today. And you also write about what Cardinal Ratzinger, just before he was elected Pope, called the dictatorship of relativism. By what standard will we settle our differences when your truth comes into conflict with my truth is the theme you come back to often. There isn't any such horizon or standard. So either you will impose your power on me or I will impose my power on you. And you write that postmodern Western culture in the West teaches that there is only your truth and my truth. And you give us the encouragement here. You must insist calmly and reasonably that there is not simply your truth and my truth, that there is actually something properly called the truth, which we can access, if imperfectly and incompletely, through reason, a reason that Catholics would insist is amplified by revelation, even as our understanding of revelation is purified by reason. What more can you tell us on this?
Well, this is a great theme of the pontificates of both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, namely that faith and reason need each other. Faith needs reason to prevent faith from becoming superstition. Reason needs faith to challenge it, to expand the horizon of its sense of possibilities. John Paul II, particularly in the encyclical Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, challenges philosophy to enlarge the scope of its interest. Why, he asks, has philosophy really, since the late 18th century, been concerned about thinking, or even later about thinking about thinking, and not with the big questions? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is my destiny? Is there life beyond this life? What is truth and what is falsehood? What is noble and what is base? Those are great questions. And philosophy would do well, John Paul insisted, to return to those questions, as it had at the very beginning of the philosophical enterprise, 7 centuries before the birth of Christ in ancient Greece, rather than frittering away its time thinking about thinking in a kind of trap of self-absorbed reflection that we never get out of and never encounter the real world because.
Yes, yeah. So we must, this is something that we must contend with, this dictatorship of relativism. And again, throughout, especially in the commencement addresses, but in the lectures as well, I would say you come back to addressing this often as what is really at the very core of what we're facing. And we're going to get into a lot more here with George Weigel, including why we might want to make sure that we don't have a sour taste when it comes to the idea of being a culture warrior. What does that really mean? And how are we actually called to be agents of, I would say, authentic humanism, Christian humanism in the culture wars, real culture warriors? What does that rightly mean, and how are we called to do this? We're also going to get at, what is the answer with respect to how do we go about dismantling the dictatorship of relativism in the public square? This is a question that I think is very important for us to face. We're going to face it right when we get back with George Weigel. Stay tuned.
iCatholic Mobile is a 5G wireless provider dedicated to supporting your faith and values, offering unlimited talk and text, reliable data, and plans that support Catholic causes. A portion of every dollar helps sustain the mission of the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. With nationwide coverage, iCatholic Mobile connects you to what matters most. More information is available at iCatholicMobile.com.
iCatholic Mobile underwrites for the Station of the Cross.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Avens here with George Weigel. He's a distinguished senior fellow of Washington's Ethics and Public Policy Center. You can find the Ethics and Public Policy Center website at eppc.org. That's important because you can find George's recent article on Flannery O'Connor's centenary there. Looks very interesting. Haven't gotten to that yet, but I look forward to doing so. And also, though, you can pick up the new book by George Weigel. That's what we're discussing today. Pomp, Circumstance, and Unsolicited Advice, Commencement Addresses, and University Lectures. Wherever you find books, find it at your local Catholic bookstore. Also, the publisher, Ignatius Press at ignatius.com. George, you write in here that Catholics should bring, well, you say it this way, Catholics in public life should make our arguments in ways that our fellow citizens who may not share our theological premises can engage and understand, which is to say, in our particular case, that Catholics should bring to bear in public life the moral truths we hold through arguments framed by the grammar and vocabulary of the natural moral law. So to me, this seems extremely important as a way to counter the dictatorship of relativism that is on the march, is that we've got to be able to bring truth in some way, help people to encounter objective truth and to be able to speak about this if we're going to get anywhere with them. And yet at the same time, they're not always going to be open to a theological discussion, which you also write beautifully about our task of evangelization, of reminding people our story, salvation history, and helping people to enter into that. But when it comes to just engaging people in general in public life, to be able to have this common grammar and vocabulary of the natural moral law seems so important. How can we do that?
Well, Jim, let's take a very pertinent American example. Between 1973 and 2022, the bishops of the United States, Catholic bishops of the United States, were at the front of the pro-life movement. And during those 49 years, the bishops never made an explicitly Catholic argument for the right to life from conception to natural death. What did they say? They said simply two things. One, the product of human conception is a human creature, a human being, at a very early stage of development. This human being at a very early stage of development has a unique genetic identity. He or she has a capacity for internally generated, self-directed growth and development. And you can learn this from a biology textbook in high school. This is not some Catholic weird stuff. This is the science. Let's follow the science. And the second thing the bishop said is that a first principle of justice in any decent society is that innocent human life deserves the protection of the law. You put those two things together and you get a pro-life proposal, conviction, that anyone who is willing to think for more than 30 seconds can engage. And that helped shift our culture in a different direction. The day after Roe versus Wade was handed down in 1973, the New York Times had an editorial saying the abortion argument in America is over. Well, that certainly wasn't true. It continued for another 49 years till the Dobbs decision. It continues today, and we can continue to make the argument for the legal protection of unborn human life without appealing to our beliefs. You don't have to believe that there are 7 sacraments. You don't have to believe in the Immaculate Conception. You don't have to recite the Nicene Creed to understand that the product of human conception is a human being, period, and that any decent society offers legal protection to innocent human life. Now, having said that, we have also learned over the past 50 years that arguments are not enough, that witness is necessary. Crisis pregnancies are called crisis pregnancies for a reason. These are women in crisis. They deserve something better than a technological pseudo fix to their situation. And so, in addition to making those public arguments that anybody can engage, the pro-life movement in the United States created over 3,000 crisis pregnancy centers where women in difficulty can find a humane response, not a alleged technological fix to their circumstance. So argument and witness go together, and that is how we will eventually turn the whole country in a pro-life direction. You know, there's one other thing. We're talking on June 30th. 5 days from now, July 4th. A year from then, the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, Declaration of Independence. For the entirety of American history until Roe versus Wade, the story of America was a story of expanding the community of common concern and protection. We ended slavery, we enfranchised women, we made our streets and sidewalks and buildings accessible to people with physical handicaps. All of this was about expanding the commons, expanding the community of concern and protection. Roe versus Wade drastically shrank that. And in that sense, it was a deeply un-American decision. So we can appeal to our history of enlarging the community for whom we accept responsibility, as well as making those scientific and philosophical arguments that I just mentioned.
Yes, yeah, very well said. And yeah, that witness and the proclamation of truth along the lines of natural moral law, the foundational principles even of our nation, as you bring up July 4th and the 250th anniversary of our nation's birth, the Declaration of Independence coming up next year. It says we hold these truths to be self-evident, and the first of those inalienable rights, the right to life. And yet we still live in a time where even after Dobbs, we have this philosophy that some innocent human beings can be killed, can be intentionally directly killed if we want to. Now, this is something that at this point, the various states are making various determinations, but I think as President Lincoln once said in his House Divided speech, it's going to become all the one thing or all the other. We've got to get this right. And it comes down to that foundational moral truth of when do our unalienable rights begin? Of course, they begin when we begin at conception, fertilization. Now, that's not a matter of revealed faith, but should be a matter of some elemental, just moral principles and foundational moral principles. And that should be common sense. That should be, as our framers said, self-evident. Sadly, though, it doesn't seem to be that self-evident to enough people for us to really outlaw this practice of abortion, of child murder completely. And I think so. It's concerning because this is ongoing. 3,000 children being killed every single day in our nation, 200,000 worldwide every single day by abortion. But now we've got these emerging technologies where if we have the error here, that is then ensconced into these emerging technologies, this can get a whole lot worse. You talk about it in one of the commencement addresses. You say that I believe that historians of the future will remember the decryption of DNA and the mapping of the human genome as the decisive scientific fact, indeed, the decisive human fact of these times. And you say the new genetically based technologies will give us the means to remanufacture the human condition by remanufacturing human beings. And in this power, unprecedented in history, lies a world of temptation. If we do not, as a civilization, resist those temptations, the world will suffer the kind of dehumanization that was once imagined only by novelists. And this news just out just a few days ago now. This is from the BBC. Work begins to create artificial human DNA from scratch, talking about how this goes beyond the Human Genome Project, which enabled scientists to read all the human genes like a barcode. The new work that is getting underway, called the Synthetic Human Genome Project, potentially takes this a giant leap forward. It will allow researchers not just to read a molecule of DNA, but to create parts of it, maybe one day all of it, molecule by molecule from scratch. So it seems to me if we don't get these foundational moral principles right at this point in history, before these emerging technologies really take off, we're going to get into a much bigger mess than we're already in, which is already very grave. What is your thought on it? Should there be more? Shouldn't we be seeing more of a fight on these points from those of us who, I guess, would understand these principles and seek to advance them? It doesn't seem like it's matching the urgency of this time. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, interesting that you mention that British development, because in the last 2 weeks, middle 2 weeks of June of this year, the British House of Commons both approved a bill allowing for abortion at any point in a pregnancy, any point, 2 minutes before birth, as well as a so-called physician-assisted suicide bill. So the Mother of Parliaments seems to have reduced the notion of freedom to, I did it my way. This is really bad. It's bad governance. It's bad culture. And can anyone really say that since the abortion license became so widespread in the Western world, and now the euthanasia license, can anyone really say that our world has become a warmer, more compassionate, less contested place? No. Our public culture has become cruder. Our sense of responsibility for others has become more severely attenuated. And, of course, the mantra of choice, which seems to shut down all political argument, has to be contested by our saying, choose what? Choice by itself means nothing. Choice is my 2.5-year-old grandson simply banging on a piano keyboard because he chooses to do it. What we need to say to people is complete the sentence. What are you choosing? Choose what? Because it's the object of the choice that makes that choice noble or base.
Yes, yeah, we're going to get into that as well when we get back. So I promise we're going to get to that unpacking of understanding culture wars, culture warriors. What does that really mean? What are we really called to there? But then, yeah, to really get into the positive vision here, this was one of my favorite aspects of, I would say, Pope St. John Paul II, St. John Paul the Great, in the way that he called us out, the way that he challenged young people, but all of us, giving us this great vision, this scope of who we are and what we're called to. George Weigel does a fantastic job in echoing this forth. We're going to get into a lot of that when we get back as well. What are we for? We're going to be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with George Weigel discussing his new book, Pomp, Circumstance, and Unsolicited Advice, Commencement Addresses and University Lectures. You can get it at ignatius.com. In this lecture, George, recent lecture from only November 2023 from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, entitled John Paul II, The Priority of Culture and the Contemporary Culture Wars. You conclude in this way. You say that failure to engage the contemporary culture war is not just imprudent or cowardly, it is a dereliction of duty, for only by returning to the truths disclosed by both reason and revelation can we avoid self-destruction and survive, even flourish as a civilization. That rescue mission is one the Church has undertaken in the past. This is what the Church must do today and in the future. In that very Catholic sense, culture warrior is a title to be welcomed, indeed embraced. And we find the ideal of the Catholic culture warrior in the apostle of culture, Pope St. John Paul II. Unpack this a little bit more for us, if you would.
Well, Jim, as you know, over the past decade or so, there has been a lot of criticism from the Catholic left of those of us who believe that we are called not simply to meet the culture, but to convert the culture. This, in one respect, goes back to a confusion over the purpose of the Second Vatican Council, which was not simply about the Catholic Church meeting the modern world. It was about the Catholic Church evangelizing the modern world. Now, at different moments in history, the gospel is going to come into a culture as a shock, and that, I think, is increasingly the case today. The claims of the gospel that we are not simply congealed stardust, we are creatures of a loving creator who created us for a glorious destiny of eternal life with him. The idea that society is not simply an aggregate of individuals, but an organic, living thing in itself, in which we all have a measure of responsibility for each other. The idea that we have access to that creator through prayer, through worship, through liturgy. All of these ideas, these culture-forming ideas, which shape the culture of Western civilization for millennia, are now regarded as pretty odd throughout the Western world. The idea that worship is a noble activity, a humane activity, this is what adults do, that comes not easily in a Western world where the object of worship is too often myself. The idea that we have a destiny beyond our imagining sounds simply too good to be true. The notion that we are more than simply an accident of random cosmic biochemical forces that over 15 billion years simply happened to produce Jim Havens and George Weigel. That comes hard for people to hear, because they've been taught by defective forms of modern science, I would say, not real forms of modern science, that we are simply aggregates of material. The notion that we have a soul, that there is a living part of us, a spiritual part of us that never dies, that has an eternal destiny. This is a countercultural claim. So when the gospel gets preached today, when the idea that the unjust death of a just man was the turning point of human history, and then through his resurrection revealed the full truth about the human condition, to talk about those things is going to make you countercultural. But we're not being countercultural just to be different or to be a pain in the neck or to making people feel uncomfortable. We're being countercultural in order to form an authentic humanistic culture that allows human beings to flourish, that allows society to live in solidarity, and that points us towards a better future.
Yes, yeah. Truth is countercultural in a culture that considers itself postmodern and can dispense with all truth. And so yes, we have no choice here. We must be countercultural, and you do a great job of laying this out for us in terms of really who we're called to be and what we're made for. And you cite a book that I was very pleased to see turn up a few times in here, and that's a book called The Sources of Christian Ethics. You write about it here. You say Veritatis Splendor tried to address that set of problems by restoring a richer, nobler understanding of freedom to the public life of the West. And this you're talking about how people will reach for chains if chains are perceived to be the only alternative to chaos. So sort of this eventual tyranny that can take place, and then people are happy to find a strong man and be in bondage at that point. But you're saying, look, we need a richer, nobler understanding of freedom to the public life of the West. Here, John Paul II drew on the thinking of a Belgian Dominican moral theologian, Father Servais Pinckaers, who, in his extraordinarily important book, The Sources of Christian Ethics, analyzed the difference between what he called the freedom of indifference and what he called the freedom for excellence. Can you share with us the meaning of this, the freedom for excellence?
Freedom for excellence, as Father Pinckaers understood it, and as I think John Paul II understood it, meant that freedom is not a free-floating faculty of choice, talked about this a minute ago, that can legitimately attach itself to anything simply because I choose it. That's to reduce freedom to simply a matter of willfulness. And willfulness is a 2-year-old concept of freedom. Jim, we're all natural-born tyrants. When we're 2 years old, we're tyrants, and we're little beautiful packages of willfulness. We want what we want when we want it, and we make a big squawk until we get it. That's not an adult way of living. What Pinckaers meant by freedom for excellence is freedom that is tethered to truth, that aims at goodness, and that is an exercise of our reason in choosing freely, not under coercion, but freely, what we can know to be good, what we can know to be life-giving, what we can know to make for human flourishing, and to do that as a matter of moral habit. It's like speaking a language coherently. Anybody can babble, but in order to speak a language coherently, to be able to communicate with others, you need to learn vocabulary and grammar. Those are rules. The rules of the moral life, whether those are the rules we know from Revelation, the Ten Commandments, or the natural moral law rules we discussed a moment ago, are guideposts, guardrails, ordering our exercise of freedom so that the exercise of that freedom leads to personal flourishing, ultimately to beatitude, and to social solidarity. But if we simply understand freedom as I choose whatever, and you have to respect that, then that's a prescription for both personal sorrow and utter chaos in society.
You write in here, too, about the example, as you mentioned earlier, the 2-year-old pounding on the piano versus, taking those piano lessons and learning to put your fingers in uncomfortable ways to start to learn how to actually play. And that's not necessarily enjoyable at first. But then, once you gain that virtue, that good habit, that freedom for excellence, to be able to then play, to sit down and to play almost effortlessly, and to be able to enjoy that facility. So this is what we're called to in the moral life. Right. And you write about this as well in here, which is, I think, a problem that Pope St. John Paul II encountered in his time. And I think we still face it, but maybe it's not as new, or it's not as head on. And that is this idea that that you would hear. I think I remember Hillary Clinton bringing this forward in one form at one point, saying with regard to sexual ethics, well, we just can't expect that any of these young people are going to actually do what we're trying to tell them to do in terms of live in a sort of a virtuous way sexually, which we would say, of course they can. Of course we can do this. And of course we should call people on to do this and strive to do this ourselves as well, to build the virtue. And if you want some help with that, hey, there's something called grace, and this is where the evangelization can come in. But even before that, just to have this grammar, what you're talking about, this natural virtue. And it seems like there are a lot of people that get this. You see, people that are doing great things with natural virtue in various fields. So this should be fairly self-evident that we can be a virtuous people. And in fact, we have to be. You cite often in here the 1991 writing from Pope St. John Paul II, Sanctissimus Annus, where he talks about, look, we have to be a virtuous moral people, or else society is going to break down. It doesn't just work with economics and government. You actually have to have virtue. Can you speak more to that?
Well, let's go back to the fact that we're a year out from the American semi-quincentennial, which is a pretty clumsy word, but it's the only one we've got for a 250th anniversary. The founders and framers of the United States understood that politics is downstream from culture. John Adams, shortly before his death, answered a correspondent who wrote the former president and said, when did the American Revolution begin? Did it begin with the firing of the shots at Lexington and Concord? And he said, no, the American Revolution began in the minds of the American people long before it became a political event or a military event. And the founders and framers knew that it took a certain kind of people living certain virtues to make democracy work. Democracy is not the normal condition of humanity. Self-governance takes discipline. And a society can't be disciplined, it can be self-disciplined, unless the individuals who are component parts of that society are self-disciplined. I mean, all this stuff seems so obvious, and the fact that we have to say it today, is some indication of how curious our cultural condition has become. But we need to renew over this next year, between now and the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, a sense of what was called back then Republican virtue, small r. The virtues of respect for others, the virtue of engaging differences with civility and not shrieking at each other. Let's get off of the social media. Let's stop exchanging snark barrages, and let's start talking to each other again. That would be a good way to move towards the 250th anniversary of the founding of the American Republic.
Yes, yeah, that would be very good. And let me give one more quote here from the book. You talk about this. I think this is a fascinating idea to ground democratic equality on equal moral responsibility before the truths of the natural moral law we can know by reason. I hope that someday political theorists and political philosophers will take up that proposal and develop it further. Real quick as we head into the break, anything else to say on that to make sure we understand that point?
Jim, why don't we come back to that on the far side of the break? Because I think that's a very important point, and it's worth developing in more time than we have in this segment.
Great. Yes, absolutely. Sounds good. In fact, when we get back, we're going to open the floor in the final segment and let George Weigel share anything that he wishes to share with us. So we're going to get what he wants to make sure to get across to us before the end of the program. We'll have an entire segment to do that when we get back. So stay tuned for that. And again, just want to highly recommend the book, Pomp, Circumstance, and Unsolicited Advice, Commencement Addresses and University Lectures, Ignatius.com. You can find it there. I think you're going to find it very enjoyable, very helpful. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with George Weigel talking about his latest book, Pomp, Circumstance, and Unsolicited Advice, Commencement Addresses and University Lectures. You can find it at Ignatius.com or wherever you find books. And this is what we have. I'll set George up with this. He writes here in this university lecture on Veritatis Splendor, how do we assert human equality in a world where inequality presents itself to us every day? The Pope made an interesting suggestion in Veritatis Splendor. He said the most secure ground on which to assert the fundamental equality of all people, so crucial to democracy, is to recognize the responsibility of every human being before the moral law, before the truths of the moral law that we can know by reason. I think that is a fascinating idea, to ground democratic equality on equal moral responsibility before the truths of the natural moral law we can know by reason. I hope that someday political theorists and political philosophers will take up that proposal and develop it further. George, please share more on this.
John Paul II never lived in a mature democracy in his life, yet he had a very keen insight into some fundamental problems of democratic life, the democratic form of governance. And one of those insights was would go something like this. Everything we encounter in life daily tells us that people are unequal. Some people are smarter than other people. Some people are more beautiful than other people. Some people are more athletically gifted than other people. Some people have greater physical endurance than other people, and so forth and so on. Our common quotidian daily experience is of human equality. So how in the world do you explain the democratic conviction that everyone is equal before the law? I mean, is that just pragmatic? Things work better that way? And in the encyclical Veritatis Splendor, he suggested that the real ground, the firmest foundation for the notion of human equality in a democratic political community was that each of us is responsible to the most basic principles of the natural moral law. It is always wrong to kill an innocent person. Everybody can know that and should live by that. Rape is never acceptable, no matter what the circumstances or the intention of the rapist. Everybody can grasp that and understand it and live by it. Destroying institutions of cultural memory is always wrong. Everybody can or should be able to grasp that and live by it. I just think that's a fascinating way to think about the problem of equality in a world of manifest inequalities. And if we started thinking about equality in those terms, it might help us, get a new grip on the fact that some things, some acts from a moral point of view are simply off the board. And there's no way to ever justify them. I mean, we call those intrinsically evil acts. And unfortunately, some people deny that there are any such things. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, it sure is. And it's hard to understand how they can try to do that when, again, the examples that you lay out, is there somebody when you actually pin them down and ask them, so you mean you are in favor of killing some innocent people? You're okay with that? And this is the time that we live in, where we have this law of child murder, of abortion, where there are people that when you pin them down, they will say, you can get them to the point where they will say, yes, I'm okay with that. I think if we can talk to people on that level, again, calmly, reasonably, but help them to actually see what they're saying, and then leave them with that and be able to just say, well, do you hear what you're saying? I don't know if you really deeply think about that, if you actually agree with what you're saying. And then maybe they have to face the actual principle that they're violating there and think about it again. In the case of, I guess what would even be more obvious to people, because I don't think there are people advocating for legalizing rape. And so I think everybody would be able to quickly agree, yeah, that's intrinsically evil, right? So it's hard to see how people can argue for these things. And yet, this is the time we're in. So yes, all the more reason that we need to be well equipped with an understanding of what the natural moral law is, to be able to talk to people reasonably, authentically, lovingly, and to really advance person by person, and really help people to see the truth, the objective truth of these things, starting with the fact that there is such a thing as objective truth, as absolute truth that is true at all times, in all places, on various matters. But George, I want to give you the rest of the time here. We have a few minutes to go. Anything else you want to share with us today? The floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you, Jim. I would simply mention that the purpose of this book, which is drawn from my life over the past 20 years in college and university settings, academic settings, is to make a contribution to the reform of higher education in our country and indeed in the Western world. The Catholic Church invented what we know as the university. It invented it in the High Middle Ages in places like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Krakow, Prague, Salamanca. And because the university is, as John Paul II wrote, from the heart of the church, ex corde ecclesia, the church ought to have something to say, and Catholic institutions of higher education that are authentically Catholic ought to be able to make a contribution to repairing the colossal mess that much of American higher education finds itself in today, including the kinds of messes that we saw on prestigious campuses over the past year and a half, when you have overprivileged, undereducated little snowflakes chanting anti-Semitic, genocidal slogans. I mean, if that doesn't indicate that something is wrong, and that wrong may have something to do with those institutions of higher education losing a grip on the very idea of truth, which we've been discussing for the past hour here, then you're not getting it here. And Catholic institutions of higher learning can model a better future for American colleges and universities. I hope this book helps a little bit to make that point.
Yes. Anything to add? I know we're in the 30th anniversary year of Pope St. John Paul II's very important encyclical, The Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae. Anything? We've been encouraging people to take it up in this anniversary year and reread it. Anything that jumps out to you that you'd like to lift up with respect to The Gospel of Life?
Well, thank you. Thank you for lifting that up yourself. Evangelium Vitae was an incredibly important statement by John Paul II, and it has everything to do with the renewal of culture and society. Our societies are not becoming more humane. They're becoming more coarse because of the practices of abortion and euthanasia. As Father Richard Newhouse would often say, when the impermissible is made permissible, it soon becomes obligatory. That's going to happen with euthanasia if we don't stop that train from roaring down the track the way it is right now.
Yes. Yeah, George Weigel, thank you so much for being with us today and for all your great work. Again, folks can find you over at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, eppc.org. Also, check out the book and get it at ignatius.com. God bless you all.